Hey guys, welcome back to my channel and welcome to chapter 11 of this cross-origin resource sharing course. And in this chapter, we're going to talk about Spring CORS configuration options. So we've come a long way. We've been talking about mostly CORS specification concepts, and we were using only one approach to configure CORS in Spring Boot. That's the cross-origin annotation. And I didn't want to mix the core concept of CORS with different nuances in Spring because I just wanted us to focus on the concepts. That's why I used the simplest configuration option, which is cross-origin. However, that is not the only available configuration option. As you can see on the list, we have two other configuration options. One is Spring MVC, where we declare a configurer bin and add our configurations there. And then the Spring Security DSL, where we declare a CORS filter and we also add the configurations there. So basically, many times you'll hear that we have local configs and global configs, and very many people mention cross-origin annotation as the local config, which has fine-grained control of where to apply a course configuration at controller level and then at method levels and all. And they consider this to be the local configuration option, and then the other two to be global configuration options, which makes sense from the perspective that the cross-origin annotation is used in the controller itself. Okay, it's you don't need to give it a path to say that target this path and declare it centrally somewhere. You have to move that configure. It's local because the configuration is moved to the use site, like in the controller itself. Strictly, we use it in the controller. But the other two are declared centrally, and then they target different endpoints and different controllers. But in terms of the aspect of local versus global, all of them can be used to for cross origin. Global scope means that within the controller itself, you can declare it on top of the controller to affect all endpoints in it, like we saw, or you can declare it on top of each method to have effect only on that HTTP method or controller method. So that is it can cause a bit of confusion when someone says global and local. So for course, it is local in terms of where it is placed, right? It's like placing a service annotation on a service class, such that the Spring Boot, Spring's component scanner can pick it up and treat it as such, versus declaring the service method without any annotation and then exposing it from a configuration class. So one side is a centralized configuration, the other one is a local configuration. So maybe the right thing would be to say that these three options are categorized into two. One is centralized configuration, which covers the last two, Spring MVC and Spring Security DSL, and the other one is localized configuration, which is cross-origin annotation. I think that would make more sense because saying global and local may be a bit misleading because also within cross-origin annotation there is a global and local configuration within the scope of a controller itself. So let me not go too deep into that, but at least I hope it makes sense. So we've covered cross-origin extensively already because we've been using it throughout. However, I want to talk about an aspect I mentioned in another video much earlier, where I said that cross-origin annotation gives you fine-grained control inside the controller. Like I've just mentioned, we have global configuration and local configuration inside the controller. Where, for example, if I go to my controller here, I could declare a cross-origin annotation here, and then declare a cross-origin annotation here. And the question is, what does Spring Boot do? At least we know what happens when we declare it at the controller level. It's global. It applies to all HTTP handlers inside here. Let me add another one, which is API slash CORS 2. And then I say it should return string. So I've declared a second handler so that we can compare the difference in behavior between the two. So the point I want to raise is that I've declared a cross-origin annotation on the controller and then a cross-origin annotation on the method. Uh, what does Spring Boot do when it encounters these two? What will happen is that if it encounters this and it's trying to load this controller method, it will apply all the settings brought about by the cross-origin annotation on the controller into this method. However, when it's creating this handler, it will see that there's a cross-origin annotation when it already had another annotation at that level on the controller. So it will put them side by side and combine them. When they're combined, we end up with a single configuration. So the question is, what does the single configuration look like? And the answer is that Spring Boot also has configuration combination rules for combining two CORS configurations together when it encounters them. So what we are going to focus on is that what are the rules for combining these? And it's very important to understand because there are folks who may say that, for example, variable scope rules apply to this. Like if I define a variable here, and then I define another here with the same name, and I print it here. Some people may say that the local one will override the global one. For variable scope, this is correct. It makes sense. And because of that understanding, someone may be tempted to apply the same understanding to cross origin configuration. And this is actually the same mistake I made. I thought automatically when you add a global and a local cross origin annotation, Spring Boot will merge the two, but look for fields which are defined in the local scope and override those in the global scope. But this is not the case. There are different combination rules based on the configuration that we're talking about. A different, for example, for allow origins, it's different from allow credentials. It's different from. So we're going to see basically how Spring Boot does this, and I think that will be very important to understand. So before we proceed to demo that, I just want us to take some time to look at the configuration rules, the combination rules. So basically, there are three combination rules followed by Spring Boot. I don't know if it follows them in order, but all I know is that they apply consistently. And the first rule is it checks. Now, see, we have two course configurations side by side, and Spring Boot is about to merge them. So, what it does is it checks default versus explicit configurations. So, if you have a cross origin, like we stated here, across origin at this level and at this level. These two will be brought together, and Spring Boot will look at them and see and try to create a final configuration object by picking the different fields from the two configurations. And the rule of default versus explicit says that regardless of the source of these configurations, as long as I'm combining two of them, then the default values will be overridden by any explicitly defined values, right? If you define origin explicitly in one configuration and you leave it as default in the other configuration, Spring Boot will take the explicitly defined or developer defined configuration. And then the second rule is local versus global configs. So to while executing this rule, we need to build a mental model that the configurations contain only explicitly defined fields or headers. So if Spring Boot realizes in both configurations, and it does the default versus explicit check and realizes that the fields are both explicitly defined, then it goes ahead and tries to apply the local versus global configs. So if you define origin in the if you define origin in one config and it is left as default in the other config, then Spring Boot will apply some rules to the effect that it takes the local config over the global config for one scenario. Then in other scenario, it just combines them, and we're going to see how that works. And then the last rule is wildcard for list configs. So there's a nuance around when one value defines a wildcard and the other one defines what I could say defines a specific value. So there's a difference there as well. So let's just get right into it and look at these rules. So here's our browser and IDE. I'm going to start making the changes over here. So just a moment, let me mute my phone. I'm getting calls that are disrupting me. Okay, so explicit versus default configs. Simple. This is a default config, like I mentioned in previous demos. When you just declare cross-origin annotation, Spring Boot will set every CORS header in default mode. Origin is set to wildcard. Allowed headers is set to wildcard. Allowed HTTP methods is set to wildcard. Credentialed request is set to empty. Exposed headers is restricted. Is not. It's set to empty. Okay. So that is the default configuration. So what I'm going to do is to use the example of origin. So here, let's first test to make sure that the request will pass through. The server has started. We come to the browser here. We're sending our request to API calls to. I think let me make this credentialed request so that we only focus on looking at the pre-flight request. So I've saved it. I should see a request here. Okay, I was not on that tab. Let me just refresh it. So we have a pre-flight request, and you can see, just pay attention to the content type I've added. It is allowed, but I didn't allow it explicitly over here. So default setup allows this header, and then the access control allow origin is a wildcard. I didn't set it explicitly, but it is allowed. So let's say we have default over here, we have default over here. But in the local one, assuming I set an explicit value for allowed headers and I exclude content type from it. So let me say X custom. Now, let me refresh that. Explicit value is expected to override the default value. So when we refresh, it should refuse. So here, the error is generic as we saw the reasons before, but if you go to Spring Boot logs, you'll see that content type are not allowed. The headers, this is not allowed. But if I call this, of course, it will be allowed. You know why. But I just want to make the difference between default versus explicit config. And now I want to make the difference based on the fact that it doesn't matter the scope, whether it's global or local. Spring Boot will choose the explicitly defined value. So that means that even if I move this configuration to the global scope and I leave this in default mode, the local one will not override the global one for the allowed headers, right? So before I restart the server, let's see the fact that the global config The global config applied to both APIs, right? So when I ran that, the request was rejected on account of the content type header. But if I send the request to CORS2, let me just refresh. The request passes because my configuration was applying globally and it was only overridden in the local one. But now I've moved this explicit definition to the global scope and left the local scope generic. So what will happen? You guessed it. The global scope will override the local scope only on account of explicit definition of a property. So I'm going to come here and I'm going to refresh that. It has failed for course 2. Reason being, this global one, this allowed headers is applied here. But of course, most importantly, we want to check if you define a generic or a default local config, does it override the global one? And I want to prove that it is a no. It doesn't override the global one. So let's change this to course, the first one. I refresh. Yep, pre-flight has failed. If we go to the console logs, the latest log is that content type are not allowed. So this proves that regardless of where the configuration is, whether on the global scope or local scope, as long as one of the values is explicitly defined, only that explicitly defined value will be chosen over the default value. Okay, so um, now that is that, and I think next is for me to talk about the other rule, local versus global configs. And as I mentioned, assume that both configurations that are being combined define explicit values, and we can just test it very quickly with this exact setup. So I have defined here an explicit value for allowed headers. I've defined here default values for allowed headers, and we've already seen that the global one overrode the local one. But if both of them are defined explicitly, allowed headers, I'm going to add content type header here, and then I will add another value. Let's do max age 3600, so that it's not default, and I add here max age 7200 seconds. So let me first do like in test driven development. Let's set our expectations of what will happen. So both of these configurations, both global and local, have explicit definitions for the fields we're interested in. Okay, allowed headers and max age. So the point, when we move from default to both are explicit, then the rule changes. And this rule changes on two fronts. One applies to fields that are lists versus fields that are single values. For example, here, allowed headers is usually a list of values. Max age is just a single value. So what happens if Spring Boot encounters cross-origin annotation on the global level and cross-origin annotation on the local level, and both of them define fields explicitly? What happens to list values? For example, allowed headers and origin and exposed headers, everything that takes a list. What Spring does is apply an additive rule. It simply combines. So that means that the final configuration will have content type and X custom header as allowed headers. So let me just test that hypothesis. And then for single values like max age or allow credentials, Spring Boot will override. This is where the variable scope rule applies. The local definition will override the global definition. So I want to test these two hypotheses. So let me restart that. Okay, I come to my browser. So I'm going to call this API with content type header, and I expect it to pass. Okay, let me refresh. Okay, so let's see the, is this the pre-flight request we're looking at? Yes. Let's see the requested headers, content type. It requested for content type. And what is the response it got? Allowed headers, content type. Only the requested header, remember, we don't want to leak data. And then access control max edge is 7,200, right? So here we defined 7,200, but the global one had 3,600. So what we've seen is that someone could say, okay, it's because we've just defined this header over here and it has overridden the other one. We can test that hypothesis by using this header instead of content type. Remember, it's at global level. So, or we can use both. Let me start with, actually, let me use both. Doesn't matter what the value is, remove the logs, save, look at the pre-flight request. Now the browser is requesting for access to send two headers, content type and X custom header. And the server has allowed both, right? The server has allowed both. But what about if we now call this API, which has not defined content type? Let's not change the headers, let's just change the API to two. And then I save here so that the request is sent. If I look at the pre-flight request, it went successfully. I requested for two headers. It responded with one. It responded with X custom header because it's defined globally, which applies to this endpoint. But only that this endpoint had a privilege of defining an additional header. The CORS 2 did not define content type. It only has access to X custom header. So if I go to the error, I go to the console, you'll see the error. It has been blocked. Request header field content type is not allowed by access control allow headers and pre-flight response. So that means that this one failed because it was trying to use a content type header, which is only allowed by the first API. And we already saw how they are combined. Okay, we already saw how X custom header and content type are combined. So let's focus on max edge, which is a singular value, like I said. In this particular latest call, which is to API 2, what value for max edge do you think will be there? It's 3,600. Reason being, it was declared at the global level, which is the only configuration Spring will apply to this endpoint. But when you call API calls, the first one, this value will be overridden, as we saw. We can just see that again. Clean up here, save so that we get a pre-flight request. Open the pre-flight request. Check the max edge, it's 7,200, the overridden value. So I think that one text really gives us clarity on the difference between how Spring Boot handles the local versus global if both are explicitly defined. Then the final nuance of combination rules is the wildcard for list configs. So this will be similar to the default or explicit configs, but in this case, there is a special case for wildcard values. For example, and this only applies to list configs, so we can remove the max edge from here and from here. So the rule says that if Spring Boot encounters two configurations and it is trying to combine or merge list fields, I already defined what list fields are: allowed headers, origins, those fields that take a list or an array and then can also take a wildcard value to mean everything. So forget okay, remember the default versus explicit rule, local versus global rule. Then consider that when it is a list, Spring Boot doesn't care whether it is global or local when the wildcard is involved. For example, here I've said X custom header is the only allowed header, all right? That means that if I send a request to that endpoint, what will happen? I will get back the headers I requested for. The reason why I'm getting them is simply because I have defined them here. However, what if I make, let me add another configuration here and I set allowed headers to a wildcard. What will happen if I call API calls to? Spring Boot will prefer the local value to the global value, but not because it is defined locally, right? Let's just test that. Maybe the difference will not be so distinct if we, let me remove, let me, I refresh. Okay, I go to course 2. That's where I'm interested. All right. So we get allowed headers as X custom header. Even if we had content type, now course 2 will still pass. Remember, at first it was failing because it could only allow X custom header since it's the global one. But now we've overridden, we've set the allowed headers value to wildcard over here. So let me just save that. The request has now passed and it is accessing both headers. All right. But this may not really give us a distinct appreciation of this point. So let me remove allowed headers and I replace it with origins. So allowed origins. If I leave these origins, okay. If I set here, if I set here localhost 3000, and then I set here origins wildcard, because at least the value returned will be distinct. So let me refresh it. Now I'm going to first call API slash CORS. What do we expect? Do we expect the allowed origin to be a specific value or a wildcard value? We can test that out. Let me call that value. Check, it's a wildcard value. Why? Because I overrode it here. The global one is specific, the local one is a wildcard. But if I call API calls to, the value will be specific. Okay, let's check the value of allow origin. It is localhost 3000. So, like I said, one could argue that it's because it's the local one overriding the global one. So, to just disband that assumption or hypothesis, let me reverse the two. Now, the global one has a generic value, it has a wildcard value. The local one has localhost 3000. So what do you think will happen? Which one will take precedence? The local one or the global one? Let's test it out. So if I call API slash course 2, which is the control API, it will display the global value. And not because it's the global value specifically. Well, someone could say that. Then let me also define a local one here, which should reject request. I think this will make for a better control. Ordinarily, the local value should override the global value, correct? In this case, we should see localhost 3000 in the allow origin header. Then in this case, the request should be rejected. Reason being, it's like I've overridden the more relaxed option with the more specific option. So let's see if for API slash CORS, the allow origin will be 3000. Okay, save it. Do you see the allow origin value? It's a wildcard. It's not the specific localhost 3000. And I think you understand the reason why. Because the global one has overridden the local one. And then we go to API calls 2. We expect this request to be rejected because localhost 4000 has overwritten the wildcard. True or false? False. The global one will override the local one. So I change this to, I save it. The request has passed. What's the allow origin value? It's a wildcard. So this is the uniqueness of the wildcard value when it comes to combining global and local configs. It's very important to understand this because you might get errors that are very difficult to configure because it is a bit unintuitive. The errors may be very difficult to diagnose because these rules are a bit unintuitive because one could think global and local together, local will override global, but there's some nuances across list values and singular values, right? So I think this is all I wanted to cover about the cross origin annotation, and I hope it has been helpful. We from this point on, we're now going to talk about the centralized. I need to call them central, not global. Central config option 1, central config option 2. So in the next videos, we shall cover the MVC WebConfigurer bin, and after that, we shall cover the CorsFilter bin. And it will really be very, very interesting, especially when we reach the CorsFilter. It's a bit complicated, but very interesting. Thank you very much for your attention. This is all I have for you today, and catch you in the next video. Cheers.